include that at the end. And so you want to be complete on that.
And it's okay to reference the web page.
Yeah.
You don't have
And
to.
if your comment needs to include a valid name, address, the segment name, like if you're referencing the document, all of the documents have page, the easiest way I found is to reference the page number. And if in a document, if you look at, let's say, aesthetics, and you're saying you can reference, there's chapter headings, like environmental settings is 4.1.2. But then at the bottom, there's also page numbers, like you could say on page 4.1-1, which is the first page of the 4.1 document, and then quote that. If you could cut and paste and say this was on page, whatever. So that's a good way to just try and reference that. And whenever possible, it's important to avoid sources that can be perceived as biased. If they think you are sort of picking and choosing your own facts from some website, they tend to not take that as seriously.
What do you mean some website?
Well, that's sort of a very subjective thing. I mean,
Yeah.
Bias is in the eye of the beholder.
A fake news website, perhaps.
Okay, so
I guess-
let's get it off the ground. About alternative facts.
Yeah.
So no quoting from Breitbart.
The alternate
No,
facts.
no, I just was wondering, because you said we could reference your website.
Well,
Any web page
Any
that you
web
go
page.
research, if you pick up data, you would want to reference the web page itself so that the experts know how to access that, and then the page number where you're taking the quote from, and then you would quote them. Yeah.
and we downloaded and edited a document called How to EIR Comment, which is this thing here. And that's available for downloading on the W.A.T.E.R website. And it's like four short pages of sort of tips and techniques on how to write an effective one, which is what I'm a little bit summarizing right here. But you can download that from the W.A.T.E.R website. And it was actually written by the Californians Advocating Responsible Rail Design website, and we sort of modified that to sort of reflect our situation. But it was one of the best ones I could find as far as sort of the rules and best practices for doing that. And, I am about ready to use up my time. So one of the things that I found most important here is to consider ways to avoid impacts or enforceable ways to reduce the severity of impacts and to quantify your objections. So for an EIR, impacts must be reduced to the extent feasible. All mitigations must be feasible and enforceable. If a potential significant impact has not been adequately identified, or if no mitigation has been proposed for a potentially significant impact, or if the mitigation proposed does not appear to be sufficient or appropriate, then you should identify the specific impact, explain why you believe that impact would occur, explain why you believe the effect would be significant, and explain what additional mitigation measures or changes to the project you would recommend. This is this kind of specific detail that I think could really be most effective in making those, and that's just in right. So that is in this document, so there's only so much I can babble on about here tonight, but that is basically it on sort of how to make comments. Did you want to say something?
Yes,
Yeah.
about what we're going to do next. So what we're going to try to do is take the subjects, give it to you in less than 5-minute bite size. Here's the big things we see. We can't give you all the technical, detailed stuff that we're going to put in because your eyes would roll in the back of your head and you'd be out of here, So we're going to try to take each topic and do that to the best of our ability.
And so we'll start with the big two here and then sort of go down the list. So we're going to be doing hydrology, wastewater treatment, aesthetics, air quality, biology, cultural, soils, climate and greenhouse gas, hazardous materials, hydrology, land use, noise, transportation. That should do it.
That's all?
That's
Traffic?
Traffic is transportation, and
Okay.
maybe we want to move that one maybe third or something. That's an important one.
Yeah, okay, we can,
So we don't lose people.
Well, they're all important.
They're all important.
They're all
Yeah,
important.
if you can stick it out for the time, we'd appreciate it. 'Cause
Okay, so we're hoping this will take about 1 hour for these presentations, and then we'll have a half hour more for questions and comments before we break out into mobbing people that you need to talk to. So, let's see here. Hydrology is going to be
I got it.
Raven.
Yeah, Dan's gonna bat first.
Oh, he is?
I'll clean up if there's anything. Yeah.
Okay, so then you can stand there and I'll bring up your slide and,
Yeah, he looks good behind the podium.
Professor Axelrod.
I use it as a defense
Yeah.
shield.
so you want the hydrology?
Yes, yes, So the subgroup in water that specializes in hydrology has carefully examined the draft DEIR, and we would like to present to you the most important of our observations. Hydrology involves the water input to the plant. The main question for the community is will the pumping hurt local residential wells temporarily during pumping or permanently? And is the pumping operation sustainable over a long period without damaging underground flow patterns, springs, and access to water by vegetation? This topic is somewhat technical, and we have only 5 minutes, so obviously we can't do a complete job here. But we can present the big picture. Our detailed response with technical details will be available in a few days. It is complete, but only in draft form now. And my comments here are basically my own opinions because they have not been properly vetted yet. So be sure to blame only me if you don't agree with something. The questions we're going to look at are, what did we hope the DEIR, the draft EIR, would say about hydrology? What did we expect that it would say? What did it actually say? And what can we do about the differences between all of those above? So first, what did we hope the draft EIR would say? Some of us in the community hoped that the EIR would recommend that Crystal Geyser not set up shop here at all. For Crystal Geyser to pack up and leave would solve all of the outstanding environmental questions. That's reasonable, but we have to recognize that unfortunately we live in a system where most of the important economic decisions are made undemocratically by a corporate elite with vast amounts of wealth and power solely in order to increase their wealth and power. Crystal Geyser is not about to respect public opinion and leave because we want them to. So for the immediate issue, Crystal Geyser exit is not the position of water. What we hoped was that neighboring wells and springs, next slide. We hope that neighboring wells and springs could be continuously monitored and the results publicly available. That if any problems were noted, then there would be mandatory short-term shutdowns and long-term enforceable caps imposed to protect the water supplies. And these would be presented as mitigations. What did the DEIR actually, well, what did we expect the DEIR to say? Because we didn't expect that we'd get what we hoped for. We expected that it would acknowledge, on the next slide, yeah, that's it. No, that was it.
There you go.
No. We expected that it would acknowledge the possibility of an impact, set up a system for monitoring, and require it through mitigations. but with no enforceable actions if problems develop, just public appeals to Crystal Geyser to respect the neighbors. It might recommend but not require further study of hydrological issues. Now, what did it actually say? The draft EIR uniformly declares that there are no significant impacts over any hydrological issues and no mitigations are required. It does suggest further studies, but with no suggestion as to who does them or pays for them. It requires no monitoring, but suggests that monitoring will be done, presumably on a voluntary basis. So here is our view of what is actually said. This draft EIR is completely inadequate in scientifically addressing one of the key issues for the community. Will crystal geyser pumping adversely affect the availability and water quality at neighboring residential wells and present and projected city wells in the area? Virtually no experimental data is presented in this regard, and the theoretical analysis that substitutes for actual testing is way oversimplified and not appropriate for volcanic regions. What was not done, but should have been done, is actually nicely outlined in the concluding disclaimer of Appendix P, the main document that concerns hydrology, written by the hydrology consulting company called RCS. This is in the words of Appendix P. Quote, "No other work, such as the drilling, testing, or sampling of existing wells at these sites was performed by RCS, nor was any field mapping or investigations performed to help determine the characteristics of the aquifer systems beneath the site. Rather, this report has relied heavily on work performed by others on characterizing the aquifer systems and on our evaluations of existing data and information." Basically, the EIR did nothing new. Crystal Geyser has always claimed that the hydrogeology of the area has been well studied many times and it passed scrutiny. This is untrue. The draft EIR makes even more clear than previous reports from Crystal Geyser consultants that there have been many reviews of past studies, but they all depend on one study done by a company hired by Dannon in 1998 called Siskiyou. So what we have is the draft EIR at the top. It refers to 3 studies, the geosyntech reports of 2014 and 2012, and a report by the source group of 2005, but those have very little relevant geological data to answer the questions that we're asking. So they refer to the Siskiyou reports. The Siskiyou is what everything stands on. The Siskiyou report is secret. It's never been released despite requests, still secret. And the purpose of the Siskiyou report was not even to address the question of the impact on industrial scale pumping on neighborhood wells. Its purpose was to find the connection of the main production well called Deck 6 to big springs so that the bottles that are produced could say on them spring water. Even proving that turned out to be scientifically questionable because of the complexity of the hydrology. They never did prove it, but eventually they did get the right to slap that spring water label onto the bottles after suing the state over the issue, which at first denied permission based on the lack of evidence. The draft EIR says almost nothing based on evidence about the impact on neighboring wells. The issue here is whether pumping from a deep well like Crystal Geyser's Deck 6 will pull down water levels in shallow wells nearby, like the neighboring residences. The EIR does not even look at relevant evidence. The EIR looks almost exclusively at deep wells, not shallow wells, on the Crystal Geyser property, and as they actually say, quote, as the EIR says, quote, "The remaining monitoring wells had much shorter periods of record and or were constructed in the alluvial aquifer," that's the upper aquifer, the shallower ones, "and thus were not considered as useful for our current analysis." So the very question that the community is asking about the impact on neighborhood wells, they said the data was not useful for their current analysis. Although the issue is ignored by the EIR, Water has obtained some indirect evidence on this issue directly from the Regional Water Quality Control Board. And that's on the next, that's on this slide here. The green line there is a measure of how far down or how high up the water was, in a shallow well on Crystal Geyser property. So this one is a decent proxy for how residential wells would behave. And during the period of the most intense Dannon and Coca-Cola pumping, that well dropped by about 6 feet. That's not in the EIR report, though. That's from the Regional Water Quality Control Board.
I can make up for it.
No,
No, they stopped.
they stopped testing it.
When did they stop?
They stopped in 2009.
As the numbers seemed to collapse, they quit monitoring it. They also quit monitoring it on the exact same day, the DEX 1 well, and said that they had battery issues. Yeah.
So this graph does not prove anything. To do so would take more data at more locations as well as more active testing. But it is suggestive of a problem, and it is completely ignored in the EIR. There's one other issue of concern to the community: sustainability. How long can water be pumped, say, before lava channels carrying the water collapse, or before groundwater levels drop farther up in the mountains so that vegetation and springs are affected? This is particularly pressing in times of drought. The EIR does not ask these questions at all, but it does say, quote, "The sustainable yield of the aquifer systems and the impact of the pumping on this yield was not determined. In order to determine sustainable yield, a more comprehensive study needs to be performed. This type of study is beyond the current scope of this project, but can be performed at a later time." So the other concerns, sustainability, they pretty much blew that off. It is clear that, quote, "beyond the scope of this EIR project," quote unquote, means that the project is inadequate and underfunded. An important aspect of the environmental impact is admittedly possible to study, but it was just skipped over for lack of time and money. So what can be done now? And that's on the last slide. We can demand reasonable mitigations in letters. For example, require monitoring of Crystal Geyser wells, make sure that the results are public, monitor residential wells paid for by Crystal Geyser, then impose enforceable limits or caps if problems are detected, and immediately have a shutdown or a slowdown if problems are noticed.
Can I say one thing?
Making the C4 report available.
No.
Yeah, we're working on that.
And of course, there's also support the ongoing legal cases and speak out. And then my last comments here.
Could you go back to that?
Leave that, yeah, leave that
Yeah, I
slide.
didn't mean to.
Yeah, because this is what we're gonna wanna write. in our- Exactly.
Well, right where it says require monitoring of CG wells, right now they say that only DEX 6 is required, and that DEX 3A and DEX 1 are voluntary. And they started using those terms when they bought the plant. So Dannon and Coca-Cola were monitoring those wells, and it was not voluntary. So you want to make sure that you ask that those be monitored as a mandatory part of the mitigation.
6 and 1.
6, 3A, and 1, and residential wells. We have, as you know, we have residential wells on the program that we've been testing now. We're in our 4th year. And.
3A.
And
It
one.
seems like it might be appropriate to say all present and future wells, if they could do another one, it wouldn't be in the mitigation, they could do whatever they want.
There you go, all present and future, very good, Dave, thank you.
So support for the ongoing legal cases, which are expensive with certified experts and lawyers providing discount rates. We do not want to be defeated just because Crystal Geyser can outspend us. One of our government representatives said that we should not spend money on the legal cases, just spend money to dig our wells deeper. He may be right. If a homeowner does have a problem, Crystal Geyser should pay to have the wells dug deeper. Crystal Geyser might say that these mitigations are a violation of private property rights, the principles of private enterprise, and proprietary information that they want to keep secret. That's too bad. The public interest should take precedence. Establishing that principle, the public interest comes first, is one reason why we are in this struggle. We can be a positive example to other communities around the country and the world facing water privatization.
So our first couple of reports will probably be a little more than 5 minutes. Hopefully our other later ones will be somewhat shorter because they have less sort of complicated and in-depth.
Can you quickly, can I take 1 minute? Can you go back to that Dex 3A slide? Oh, shoot. So, you see that 2006 line? I'm on crutches, so I'll just sit here if you don't mind. You see where it's 2006, the green Dex 3A starts dropping off? Yeah, yeah. That's about the time that all the neighbors actually started complaining that they had water issues, and concurrently that is the time where Coca-Cola bought the plant from Dannon in around 2005. And there is firsthand knowledge that they said, what the blank are we doing still trucking up water from Moss Spray Springs in Dunsmuir? They were trucking up 60% of their total water usage from Moss Spray Springs. Okay, they were trucking it in because originally they didn't have the spring water bottling license. And so